which is how I nabbed him.
Right.
But yeah, so I am doing. So I mean, yes, I'm an academic. I'm still getting used to wearing that label. And because I come into it from a very activist standpoint, it's really different than I think people who like. I didn't realize when I was going in how many people end up academics because they want to be academics. I never went in wanting to be an academic. I went in because I have a project, and I was at least humble enough to note that I don't think I knew how to do research well enough to do it on my own.
Right.
And I figured this would be a great way to learn how,
Right.
and to sort of expand my brain. And I've always liked school, and but I didn't go in thinking I still don't have any idea if I'm going to come out being a professor, right? And I may well not. But I was sort of like, I have a project, and I realize how many people go in and they're like, I want to be a scholar, and I don't have a project, and I was like, oh, I'm the weird one here. Like, I thought I was going to be with a bunch of people who did anyway. Yeah, so.
Well, you just described my trajectory.
Oh, really?
How I got into it, and I ended up becoming a scholar and academic.
Right.
Wasn't my intent at all to be a prof. In fact, I had quite a negative view.
Yep.
In my doctoral studies, I was just kind of like,
yeah,
you're gonna do that. I'd rather be in the community.
Yeah.
And then in the end, I ended up just as life does these things, I just ended up landing at York, and that's where I am. So, and I do love it.
Yeah.
But it's just like you, it was activist driven.
Yeah.
Is what brought me into studies. And it's similar. It just felt like I don't know research well enough. I don't know how to do this properly.
Yeah.
I might as well learn it.
Yeah.
Do a good study and see what it tells me. Right.
And be guided, by other people who actually know what they're doing.
Right.
And can give you some cred, Yeah, for sure. What was your topic?
Mine was, it's a long time, I have to remember what did I call it? Social policy and the health and well-being of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. So this is back in, I'm saying this, in the early 2000s.
Ancient.
Yeah, already it's becoming ancient. And so it was an international comparison of the UK, the US, and Canada.
Oh, okay.
And I did my PhD in the UK. And so I was just curious to know, whether policy recognized these populations or not, and the particular health and well-being issues and needs that we have.
Right.
And part of it was a bit of a way of challenging the literature in terms of this heavy emphasis on HIV/AIDS. And I thought
that's the only thing that gets talked about.
Yeah, and as important as that is, and I didn't want to, minimize that in any way. It was more my concern around so many other issues like depression and body image and drug use and alcohol use, and tobacco and
gender and
self-esteem.
Yeah.
How well are we accepting ourselves, and like all those things. And was the system recognizing that, and policy was funding going to programming was so that's what I've done, and I'm grateful I did. Really, when you have that opportunity to go in depth into something, it's I mean, I think you'll be quite amazed because you've got a fascinating topic. I mean, leather stuff is so, well, at least in the queer community, it's so male heavy. Maybe I don't know if it's because of my own perspective, but
the dykes are hard to find if you don't know where to look.
Yeah.
And when you do know where to look, they're still hard to find. But they're there, and they're really persistently there, which is interesting. But yeah, they're not nearly as visible. And I got theories about why, and it's really, there's a whole...
It's funny you mentioned that, because we were at Pride Ottawa this past year.
Sorry, light in the eye. Yeah.
And we went, AJ and I went to the Dyke Parade, and we got there, and we had missed it, because it started at 1:30, we got there at 1:30, and it had actually just started, and it's that small.
Yeah.
And this is Ottawa.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have a permit, they weren't allowed a permit.
Yeah, a lot of people stayed away because of that this year. It's not normally that small.
I know, but what happened was we all congregated at Minto Park. There was a big gathering after, and so lots of people came to that only, and that was beautiful.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. It's funny how it's almost like we're there, but we're not.
Yeah. And leather in that,
Yes,
the people who are able to be or willing to be visible, or who take on that identity, which is not as smooth a jump as it is sometimes in I think gay male leather worlds. And anyway, it's don't get me started, because
Yeah.
that'll be the interview right there. And then I think this, and yeah. But
Okay, so,
Anytime you're ready to start.
yeah, we'll get going now. So basically we're asking everyone to begin with just spelling out their name,
okay,
and then from there just introducing yourself by, my name is.
Saying it and then spell.
right, okay.
I thought spelling it out first would be good, just to kind
Okay,
of edit
yeah.
that piece out, and then
Sure.
you can do a flow of I
That's
am, you know,
Okay,
name,
that's good.
and then you can identify your,
It's just
how you
for us
identify
for
yourself,
editing
like-
purposes, so that
Right,
we
right.
have it right.
Sure, of
Yeah.
course, of course. And when you say how I identify,
yeah, so people have been saying, academic, activist, filmmaker, I mean, whatever the work they take on, artist, writer,
Career artist, career writer,
you know,
The list, yeah.
thinker, like whatever, blogger, I mean,
Sure.
whatever you see, what occupies your time, you can just, yeah.
Jesus, okay.
And people have been saying 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 things about
Yeah.
themselves, so
Yeah.
it's okay to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
So yeah, so if you want to start your spelling and then who you are.
Right, okay, so it's Andrea, and the last name is Zanin. So my name is Andrea Zanin, and I am a queer and SM blogger, activist, community organizer, writer, journalist, budding academic. The list gets long. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so we're going to begin with some opening questions that everyone is being asked for consistency, and that is, if you could tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation.
Well, I think that my work as a writer or blogger in particular is probably the most directly relevant, but also as an SM and queer community organizer. I think I don't know that I would have self-consciously said that my work addresses queer liberation, but it's inseparable from it in terms of what approach that I take to things. So especially when you're working around questions of SM or edgy or alternative sexuality, you sort of can't help but engage in a way with liberationism because you're necessarily breaking from the norm, right? So certainly, you know, pervy dykes maybe want to get married and adopt kids too, sure, but essentially there's something about their or our sexuality that begs a little bit of a different story, that requires to take a perspective that's not just about being the same as everyone else, but that sort of goes, well, listen, what we want is actually different, and it does actually upset people. And so if we want to get to that, if we want to talk about it, we have to tackle the fact of difference, or a perspective that's a little broader than just we want to get what everyone else already has. We don't. We kind of want a lot else as well. Maybe not just instead of, but as well. Yeah, so in that sense, when I write from that perspective. When I interview, I ask questions from that perspective. And certainly it's a critical perspective that I take on just about everything, you know? And I think one sort of example of that is, you know, I organize, or I co-organize an event called an Unholy Harvest, which is Canada's only annual weekend-long event for leather dykes and the trans people who feel a part of that community. And we are really careful in our programming and everything we do to, first of all, sort of basically go with, you know, sex is good, kink is good. These things are really basic. We don't want to bring in any shame around these things. We don't want to hide them. We don't want to make them safe, right? The idea is, yes, we are engaging with some stuff that's edgy here, and so let's do it all the way, and let's do it cleanly, right? But we also do a lot of work, for instance, on making the event accessible to people with various kinds of disabilities. We do a lot of work on making sure that that the way that we do things is really inclusive of a really broad range of genders and economic circumstances. We take an explicitly anti-racist stance in what we do, right? So it's a very politicized kind of community. I don't know if I could pull those things apart from each other. I don't know, in my mind, I don't know how I could say edgy sexuality is good, but let's not talk about race. I can't, you know, or let's not acknowledge that for some people their economic circumstances will make this a difficult event to attend. How do we work that, you know? I mean, yeah, so it's sort of a broad perspective that I think engages in the sense of queer liberation theory or approaches to things I'm so deep in it that it's almost hard to articulate, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Could you briefly give me the name of the harvest again?
An Unholy Harvest.
An Unholy Harvest.
Yeah, and if you want the website, it's just .ca
Okay.
after that.
Because I'm thinking of visuals as you were saying that.
Oh yeah,
It'd be
sure.
nice to kind of,
Yeah.
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 Great. Very good. That was wonderful.
Okay.
Can you share with us experiences, and this could be activist-based, it could be academic, in your blogging work that you've had that you think is significant for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
You're asking about experiences, work I've done, or experiences I've had because of that?
Could be either or.
Okay.
Could be either or.
Sorry, can
Yeah,
you
so
repeat the
it is a bit of a long
Yeah.
question. Can you share with us experiences or work for that matter, activist, academic-based, or blogging, or what have you, that you've had that you think is significant for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
Well, I think that the experiences that what I've had, what has happened to me in my work that I've noticed really clearly, that perhaps has made me more conscious that I am taking a liberationist stance on things, is that sometimes it upsets people. I think it's made me more aware. To me, this is all just logical, right? Like, of course you need to think about a broad range of concerns. Of course there needs to be room for difference. I don't think I had put a label on it, but I mean, I can think of, for instance, one experience that I had when I was wearing my journalism hat and I was writing for the Montreal Mirror, which is one of the weekly newspapers, sort of alternative weeklies in Montreal. And they'd asked me to interview a doctor who was coming, and a psychologist, I believe, who was coming from New York City to give a talk at 00, which is an HIV organization, you probably know, in Montreal, about crystal meth and the preventative approach that he was taking to crystal meth use and how that relates to HIV. And so I was interviewing this doctor, and I would ask him a question, and he'd give me like a one-word answer or one sentence, and he was very clipped. And I remember trying to figure out why it was like pulling teeth to get an answer out of the guy. And so I actually just asked him, I was like, what's wrong? Like, what's making you hesitate? And he said, well, a lot of people have, interviewed me, and they sort of twisted around to make it sound like whatever they're after. And I said, well, let me tell you what I'm after then. I said, here's my, among other things, I'm a translator, I'm an editor. One of my biggest clients when I first started doing freelance work was Stella, which is a sex workers' rights organization. So I dealt with.
In many ways, we're so few. And there is that whole responsibility around, in part of doing that work, is you're also kind of broadcasting, you're not the only one, there are others.
Yeah.
It's just that they can't step forward.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But is that what's at stake in that the mainstream is so big and it's so pervasive?
Mm-hmm. You're asking, so I'm like nodding right
Yeah,
with you,
yeah,
but I'm not actually sure what you're asking.
So the first part of that two-part question was, what is at stake? And I guess that's what I'm trying to link to, and that was your latter point around
Right,
having that alternative voice as opposed to the mainstream voice.
right.
Because let's say we didn't have those alternative voices.
Right. Well, and I mean, certainly, so what's at stake in a lot of cases is not to be too dramatic about it, but survival, right? I mean, you can grow up in the world, a white, privileged, heterosexual female, and still hate yourself. Absolutely hate yourself because of the messages out there about who you're supposed to be and who you're not and how much of a failure you are, right? So even sort of, close to top of the line privilege, and I mean female, male for that matter, right? Anybody, self-hatred is so endemic, right? So never mind if you've got anything about you that makes you different in any way from the sort of ideal images out there. So I think, yeah, there's a question of survival, but it's as basic as survival, as in if people have some idea that they're not the only ones who feel this way sexually, who want to do things this way, who make relationships this way, whatever that may be, breaking isolation and all these classic things, right? About you're not the only one, okay, so on and so forth. So there's the don't kill yourself piece, but then there's also just the find as much joy in your life as you can, right? Everybody. And so if there's a way to make joy more accessible to people, because all of a sudden people are talking about, I mean, I can't tell you how many people come to the relationship workshops I give on non-monogamy and say, oh my God, that's so sane, you know, because it just makes so much sense. And I'm like, yeah, it does. It's really not rocket science at all. But no one's talking about it. Or they are, but in very particular ways that don't acknowledge the diversity of people that might want to engage in that, right? Same with SM, right? There's tons of porn out there. There's tons of, you know, imagery. There's tons of, you know, rhetoric about what it is and it isn't. But there's very little that actually is, how would I put it, that's not prescriptive, right? Like, this is how you do it. You want to be kinky? Here's how, right? That's not really the question. I'm more interested in why and in what way and so forth, because I want people to find their own thing. I don't want to tell them what they're supposed to do. I want people to figure out what works for them. And there's precious few resources out there that actually ask questions instead of just give you a script, right? Mainstream and otherwise. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, that's good. No, that is good. So the next category is rights-based claims, troubling equality, and you have two down here, and I've chosen one here that's, is there a tension between the pursuit of legal rights and social rights?
I think that there is a tension, or there can be tensions between pursuing legal rights and social rights, because one of the things that helps move along a legal rights acquisition framework is, first of all, you have to create a constituency, right? There has to be a group of people, which means you have to define a group and say who's in it and who's not, which already there can be exclusionary. And then you have to find what's common to that group, how they've been wronged, and how the law will come and right things, right? So you're defining a specific group, defining their needs, and then going for something in a legal framework that in theory will resolve a problem or rectify an issue or, you know, right or wrong. And it's a very narrow framework from which to approach how to make people, you know, not kill themselves and find joy in their lives, right? It's a very particular framework, and it speaks to people often in a certain class of privilege. So necessarily, that means that some people are being left out, and so there's a tension right there. At the same time as that, I also think that there's, and this is another challenge perhaps, to the question itself, I think there is much noise made about how there are the right-wingers who are gay and who want to get married and join the military and, you know, have kids and a mortgage. And then there are the radical lefties who are super progressive and really exciting and everything they do is good and right. Right? So there's these, and I don't think it polarizes quite like that. Because what I see on the ground in my communities is people who are, you know, radical perverts who have a dominant submissive based household with two people who come in and do their laundry naked twice a week or whatever. And those people also want to get married and adopt kids, right? They aren't different people, right? All of us would like to have access to ways to make our lives healthier, happier, and more whole, right? And there isn't one way that the radicals do it and this totally other way that the non-radicals do it. I think there's way more overlap than we'd like to think. So I'm hesitant to buy into the polarization. And I mean, there's examples of this all over the place. Like I think even of Michael Hendricks, who's a major activist in Montreal and in Quebec and has been for decades. And you know, he was instrumental in getting same-sex marriage stuff happening in the province of Quebec, which is where I'm from. And you know, as soon as he finished that, I brought him to an event and he was speaking. And he said, okay, now we've got that, now what? You know, and his answer was, well, we need to be thinking about the young queers, the old queers, the trans people, and the people with HIV. You know, and he had an agenda, like he had his next steps and that's what he was gonna do, and one of his major groups in there was sex workers. So, you know, the next time I called Stella, the sex workers' rights organization in Montreal, who answered the phone? Well, it was Michael, he was volunteering, right? So we're not talking about people who, you know, have this one agenda, now they've got their privilege, they could check it off the list and, you know, go vacation in the Bahamas, right? They're not always quite so polarized. Some people can see the strategic advantage in getting certain kinds of rights, and that doesn't mean they forget about the others, right? So I kind of want to trouble the question a little bit. but there's also definitely people who are basically in it for their own privilege, and whoever they need to trample along the way, they will, and that I have a really hard time getting behind. So it's about figuring out not so much what the goal is, but how you're going about it and what else comes with it in any kind of rights acquisition framework of any sort.
Okay.
Yeah.
You start off with a pretty good description of where legal rights could take us, and yet at the same time that it, some of the downfall points of it is that it can be very exclusionary and restrictive. Do you want to just elaborate a bit on social rights? Again, not so much to polarize against it,
Right,
but
right.
just
What would that look like?
Yeah, what does that look like? Advantages, disadvantages of social rights, for that matter.
Right, right.
Beyond the legal framework.
Sure.
Right.
Well, and I think it's really easy when you're talking about social rights to fall into to over-rely on the term acceptance, right? To think about acceptance, well, everyone needs to be accepted and so forth. And that may be, a big part of it in some places, but I think it's actually more about space. I don't think it's necessarily about because if you talk about acceptance, it's almost like you're assuming there is a body of people who needs to do the accepting and another body of people who needs to be accepted. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think it's actually just more about space to be who we are and the way that we want to be, and have that not necessarily be, accepted by anybody else, but to not be made miserable for it, right? Or to not be persecuted for it. You might argue that is what acceptance is, but I would even go beyond that. There's partly the not to be made miserable, but also to be valued and to be learned from, right? So Peggy Kleinplatz is a sex therapist, clinical sex therapist and professor at Ottawa U, and she has a fabulous article called Lessons from the Edge, Lessons from Extraordinary Lovers or something like that. And she, in it basically says, listen, I have SM practitioner clients who come to my sex therapy practice, and not only do I think that they're not crazy and we shouldn't pathologize them, but I'm actually going to distill things about the way they do their relationships and how they approach their sexualities that everybody else should learn from. And I thought that was a really excellent perspective to take, and I think that's kind of what I mean in the sense of social rights for me is not just about the weird ones being thought of as okay, but the potentially the people on the fringe being seen as valuable and interesting, and potentially having things to teach the rest of the world without fetishizing them and putting them on a pedestal, which I think can be just as marginalizing as grinding somebody under your boot, right? It's actually just about going, okay, there are different ways to do things. What can everybody learn from those different ways? And can we do that without typecasting the people who do them? So I think for me that's what social rights would look like a little bit. Again, broad.
Great, that was good. So we move on to intersectionality, and there's a couple here. The first being, does queer liberation intersect with other philosophical, social, theoretical perspectives? And we have a series of examples here. You can speak to these, you can speak to other areas that have informed you and your work. For example, the politics of difference, anti-oppression, social justice, and any others. I mean, you don't have to speak to those, but
Right.
So again, does queer liberation intersect with other philosophical, social, theoretical perspectives?
I think queer liberation definitely intersects with a lot of other movements and perspectives, and I mean the ones you list are great: social justice and anti-oppression and various other ways of talking about similar things. I think that the danger with queer liberation and with talking about queer liberation is that we can end up focusing on queerness or sexuality or gender or relational differences to the exclusion of others, as opposed to seeing that as one particular angle on a massive problem that knows no boundaries, right? This question of the mainstream versus the outside, the people who have privilege versus the people who don't, right? Queer is one particular angle. For me, it's an easy angle. I'm queer. There we go, right? Like that's my experience, so I can relate to that. And when people theorize it, I can read something of myself in there, so it's easy to connect to. But I don't, by any stretch, think that this is just one way, or that it's the only way to get to these questions, right? So if I read critical race theory, for instance, they're having the same conversation, right? It's grounded in different material reality, it's different, grounded in different historical reality, the language is different, the producers of the knowledge are different, but fundamentally that critical approach, you could almost switch it out and stick queer in there. Okay, then you change all of those criteria I just mentioned, but ultimately it's a similar way of looking at the world critically, looking at who's being left out, why, how that affects people, how our concepts and categories do a disservice to people, how they're useful. All of these questions I think are fundamental to so many different strategies of and paradigms for approaching the world and our activism in it, right? And social justice is of course a part of that. I mean, queer liberation, how can that not also be about social justice, right? And if it's going to also be about social justice, well, how can we not also notice that some of the people who need social justice aren't queer, right? I mean, the questions lead into each other and they become indissociable to me. So, yeah, I think that there are ties, and potentially what each particular sort of field does is bring to bear an angle that the other fields might not do as well a job, as good of a job of doing. So, for instance, if I read critical race theory, all of a sudden I have viewpoints about race that I can then translate to queer, but also I know now new things about how to think about race, right? Which perhaps queer theory never gave me, or queer liberation as a movement never impressed upon me, right? I mean, there's, and again, to go back to the sort of the work that I do, one of the things that I can't help but notice is that in a community like the SM community, where sexuality is engaged with in really sort of visceral kind of ways and discussed in really intense ways, while we're busy saying that all of our fetishes are okay, well, what if those fetishes extend to racialized groups, right? What about Northbound Leather putting on an event with a geisha theme one year and a tribal theme the next year? What about that, this just to give sort of concrete examples of things, right? These are ways in which, sure, they're moved forward and you can maybe translate it to terms, but in practical terms, it's also doing some oppressing of its own, right? And so I think there is a need for the intersectionality of these theoretical approaches so that each one of them can be done better. And at the same time, I know that there are lots of people coming from each of those perspectives who wouldn't like that much, right? Where different paradigms don't always like to take into account the other ones because it challenges their own premises too much. So, yeah, I'm into the challenging. I think that needs to be done more. I want it to be done to me more. I want to do it to people more.
Okay. That was good. And then the second question under intersectionality, what can queer liberationists learn from such things as feminism, critical race theory, socialism, disability studies, bisexuality, non-monogamy, and or any other intersectional theoretical frameworks? And you can choose to speak to one or two of those or others that have influenced you.
Right.
So what can we learn from those?
Well, I think that we, wow, God, the list would be very, very long. I mean, I think that if nothing else, any time we engage with a theoretical or community perspective that's different from the one we're most comfortable in, we're guaranteed to learn something. As soon as you're uncomfortable, you're guaranteed to learn something. If you can choose to make your discomfort openness instead of an excuse to close, right? And so from that perspective, any one of the theoretical or community, I don't know that I would call non-monogamy a theoretical approach, which is why I'm kind of laughing about it. But as an approach to, okay, so non-monogamy, has it, there's some things that are said in communities, right? So for instance, love is not like a pie that you can divide up into pieces, right? There's a scarcity model there that doesn't really work in real life, or that we shouldn't opt for. Okay, well that's an interesting piece of, if you could call it theory, and then how would that potentially go and inform any number of other types of activism or theory thinking that we might do, right? So I mean, that's one of them, you know, if we think about that and then we apply it to our queer liberation activism, say, maybe that gives us new ideas about what we do with our activist energy, right? Or how we understand who belongs in our communities. You know, queer liberation, if we were to look at, you know, is there a scarcity model operating in queer liberation? Maybe there is, you know. Do we have other ways of handling that? Can we learn, you know, communication techniques from non-monogamy that might help us do our activism better? Yeah, I think there absolutely is reason for that, you know. In critical race theory, you know, some of the things that I have drawn from my reading in critical race theory is around questioning categories that seem to be very biologically true, right? And questioning how those categories have been historically created and what it means to continue to believe in them, even though they may be useful in some particularly rights acquisition-based models of activism, right? Okay, so can we find ways to both use them when they get us places and drop them when they don't? Can we learn to think about our, you know, I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric out there, for instance, about, you know, being born that way as queer. And that's not just, you hear that among queer liberationists as much as you do in sort of a broader GLBT context, right? Can we learn to think about that differently? Is it important that we be born a certain way? Does that have any bearing on what we should be allowed to experience or do in our lives? I don't know, right? And I don't think so. But yeah, so if I can take something from critical race theory and apply that to queer liberation, absolutely. And I think that those intersections happen all over the place. I think that if we're only ever reading or thinking or acting or engaging in community with or relating to people who exclusively think from a queer liberation perspective, we're actually not doing our queer liberation very well. I think it's incumbent upon us to learn from as many other places and frameworks as we can.
Okay, that was really good. I have thought, to further this just a bit, and you can choose not to answer this if you don't want to, but the influence, if any, of, say, feminist thought, feminist perspective. I raise that because most of our interviewees who were part of what I'm terming the first wave of the very public liberation movement for queers, which then was the gay liberation movement,
Right.
did consist in a very it's big way, if I can put it that way, as opposed to the smaller histories you were talking about,
Yeah.
of a lot of white men.
Yeah.
But these guys are saying that they borrowed heavily from the feminist movement, because that was before them, right? And yet, you know, a project like yours, looking at, you know, SM Dykes from back 10, 20 years ago or more, and there is a recognition that you know, that the old critique of you know, the middle class gay white men who tend to lead the process and don't necessarily represent the needs and issues of the broader community and stuff. So I you know, I guess I'm going all over the place here, but I'm contrasting. Feminist thought had something to teach us,
Right.
and in fact they borrowed heavily from that movement, which was very fresh just before them,
Sure.
as well as, you know, the Black movement and many other movements.
Yeah,
And speaking of those, any thoughts around that in terms of how we draw feminist thinking and perspectives in the queer liberation movement, like an intersection there, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and at the same time, yes, I think that absolutely queer liberation borrows from, relies on, in some ways is you know, there's a genesis movement here, right? Feminism happened, it continues to happen, queer liberation came after, there's a generational thing happening there too. So certainly I think that's true. I also think that movements don't happen in isolation, and so they borrow from each other, and I don't know that there is a pure feminism that then a pure queer liberation can go back and get things from. So I don't think it's quite that simple, especially since they're both ongoing, right? Feminism is not dead. But at the same time, I think it's, there are some things that, for all that I tend to be very critical of, you know, second wave feminism and a lot of its precepts, I'm still very aware how much its tenets inform what I do and what many other people do, in ways that I don't think I mean, I don't even think I can acknowledge it as well as I'd like to. But I mean, even just, for instance, the valuing of the feminine, or the refusal to disavow or denigrate the feminine, right? I think that's really crucial in queer liberation. And I think that we don't have to go the route of, talking about, women being goddesses because they have vaginas, and assuming that all women do have vaginas, and that anyone wants to be a goddess at all, right? I mean, there's a whole way of framing that I don't necessarily like or agree with, but I can still say, okay, well, that there needs to be room for this, for us to be, to not polarize gender in a binary value system, right? And I think that necessarily comes on some level from feminism, right? I also, remember in my sort of early women's studies days in the 90s, sort of, reading texts about gender, for example, and about, more or less, just because we're women, we don't have to be stuck in these particular roles, right? Which to me instantly mapped onto, and just because you're born female doesn't mean you need to stay that way. And just because you weren't doesn't mean that you can't be that way, right? And that to me, those things, and I don't think that's what they meant when they were writing that, but to me the parallel was really, really clear, right? That second wave feminist thought can be very much read as supportive of people's right to be trans, for instance, right? And I don't, like, to me those things make an enormous amount of logical sense, and the problem is when they get sort of interpreted or used in ways that end up being more exclusionary. But, so if I take that into sort of queer liberation, well, the valuing of the feminine, our right to choose our own genders, presentations, occupations, what we do with that, our right to be sexual, to have desire, to have agency, to have choice. I mean, these are all things that come a lot from feminism, and then are taken up in perhaps different contexts in queer liberation. But I think it would be a bit foolish to think that that there's no relation, right? And we can't forget that some of the same struggles are still happening now, right? I mean, people's right to have an abortion, that's fundamentally about sex and choice, and the right to, live life and have sexual relationships in ways that we want, and what we're going to do with our bodies and who's in charge of them. How is that not also about being queer, right? Or about having sex in ways that we want to have with potentially people of genders that don't fit into a heterosexual paradigm, or, right? I mean, the theories are, may have been produced in a particular context, and the way of thinking may have been produced in a particular context, but it can be so easily transplanted. And I think it's important to do that to the best of our ability when we even know it's happening. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. We're down to the last themed category,
Sure.
and this is under the theme of today and tomorrow. And are there aspects of queer liberation that you consider important or invaluable to the movement?
Say that one more time. Other aspects of
Queer liberation, yeah, that you consider important or invaluable to the movement?
Yes, sex. That would be the big one. I think that one of the key things about queer liberation that is absolutely crucial is our willingness to talk about and be visible in talking about and being sexual beings. I think that one of the key features that I think distinguishes what I would understand as queer liberation from anything else that's also about GLBT rights or activism is that it can be very, very easy to erase the sex out of things in order to move another agenda forward that's about acceptance, that's about rights acquisition. And to me, if you're doing queer liberation, you're not ever forgetting that it's about sex, that there's something in there about sex, that sex is important, that it is not to be disavowed or sort of shoved under the rug or covered in a little mask until it's more convenient, right? There's something about absolutely unashamedly saying, yes, we have sex, we may have sex in ways you don't like, and we're doing it anyway, and we're not going to pretend otherwise, right? And that to me is absolutely crucial and key about queer liberation. I think if we lose that, we've lost it. And any time I see a theory, a text, a documentary, a piece of art that tries to downplay the sex, I think that's the road to damnation. There's something severely wrong. Because sex is what's so damn upsetting to everybody, right? That's what grosses people out. That's what gets people up in arms. That's exactly where the charge lies, right? So that's where we need to go. We cannot get anywhere if we're pretending it's not happening. That, really it's not about the sex at all. It's just about relationship. Okay, that's great. I still want to get laid. Like, that's still really key, right? And if it were all about just being friends with each other, I don't think we'd be having the problems we're having. So why are we trying to make that go away? That's what actually needs to be put on the table. Yeah, to me that's utterly key to any kind of queer liberation. And that doesn't help only queers, but it's certainly a really key piece of if we're going to try and erase what it is that fundamentally makes us different in order for people to respect or understand or make space for our difference, how does that make any sense? Yeah.
Good.
It was a solid answer for it. Sex.
Somebody else also emphasized that as
Yeah,
well, that we
good.
interviewed. They just said, like, it's got to be, that's core.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right. Find this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move to your question.
Which isn't much of one, which I may have already gone to anyway.
And that is something about edgy sexualities and BDSM, leather, as this is the area that you work in. So if you want to just comment and just talk about the importance of that in queer liberation. I mean, it kind of is a bit of a jumping off from what you were just saying before, about
Yeah.
if we're talking core about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Sex itself is extremely diverse.
Yeah.
The activities of sex and how we engage with one another and relate and stuff. So in your area, you're very interested in the edgy side of it,
Mm-hmm.
BDSM, leather.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think maybe if I can use the earlier question as a jumping off point, like you said, to me, BDSM, leather, non-monogamy, these are fundamentally practices, proclivities, interests, communities, what have you, that cause us to ask questions that are relevant far beyond those particular practices, and that challenge a lot of assumptions. And for me, that's really crucial. So, for instance, the questions that come up with SM are, what do you think pain is? What do you think pleasure is? Do you think that's the same for everybody? What if somebody likes something you don't like? What if somebody likes something that lots of other people don't like? How okay is it? When is it okay? Who's it okay to do with it? How do we frame that? Now, how do we take all of that and bring it back to what everybody in the mainstream does like, right? So, for instance, one of my criticisms is often that, we talk a lot about consent in the SM community. It's a big, big theme, and I don't think it should be. Not because consent is a bad thing. Consent is a given. It's a jumping off point. The interesting conversations happen after that, right? Consent is the basic, and as it should be in all kinds of sexual situations and other situations. Why is it so specifically insisted upon with SM? Why that, right? We have this perception of SM as though it's incredibly risky, and that therefore it needs to have all of these special things around it to minimize the risk and make it safer and so on and so forth. I don't think we have that conversation about risk and consent nearly enough in non-SM situations. I think that there's a big onus on the SM practitioners who are seen as being potentially monstrous, that need to be contained in all these special, exciting ways. And I think that there's actually not as grave a difference between SM practices and everybody else's practices or all the other practices out there. And I think that I want to turn those questions around and say, okay, how much are we talking about the intricacies of consent and desire in mainstream heterosexual penis and vagina intercourse sexual situations, right? What is the degree of risk? I mean, my favorite saying is, I'm probably never going to kill somebody by spanking them, right? But heterosexual intercourse can kill you. Like, why are we having these risk conversations only in these particular areas and not nearly enough in other areas? So it's, I think to me there's this balance that the edges can cause people, or that in my mind at least, should cause people to ask much, much more careful and incisive questions about the mainstream. And not that my project is making the mainstream better, it's not, but I think that for me, when I engage with these questions in the context of SM, I can't not notice that the same ones apply, when you go to work every day, right? Who's in power? How are they managing that power? Is everybody happy with it? Are people getting things out of it? Is it oppressive in any way? Did anyone ask if it was okay, right? These things come up all over the place. And SM and non-monogamy to me are just very particularly rich sites for starting and asking those questions, but it has to bleed everywhere. Those questions have to come up in other places too. And to me, that ties into queer liberation in a lot of the same ways that the standard ones do around, who do you like, what do you want to do with them, what turns you on, and how sex is central to that movement. I think SM and non-monogamy are other angles to ask those same questions in really broad ways.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we end off the interviews by asking everyone if there's anything further that they want to add, any comments, any ideas. Given the discussion we've had, sometimes people feel like they're, and one more thing I wanted to share or whatever. So if there's anything further you want to add, you can, or not, that's up to you.
I don't think I have enough of a sense. I feel like we've done a lot of talking about ideas, and that's really, really exciting and yummy, but I don't know how it fits into your broader project, so I would actually be curious if there's anything that you think we should be talking about that hasn't come up yet, but that would make sense in the context of what we've
I love ideas.
Me too, no, this is good.
It's
good.
And I've been saying to people, because even in the planning of this, and this is part community-based, so some of the committee people I was talking about are members of Queer Ontario.
Sure.
That's the group that we're working with.
Right.
And it was very easy for them to fall into this being an oral history.
Right.
Saying, we got to get people's stories, we got to get the oral history, right? And I kept having to argue back that, but it's a thinking piece.
Yeah.
Yes, the stories are important. The oral history is going to be there for sure.
Right.
But I want to challenge the audience watching this. I want to think about what's being said and the ideas and get people's minds to shift. So that's anyway where I was coming from in terms of my love of ideas.
Yeah.
You brought a lot forward.
Right.
If you want, I don't know, is given this discussion, are there stories you want to share? Or is it just even a little story or historical stuff that you've done or whatever? I mean, you're welcome to that.
The CV is long.
Where do you pull from?
Yeah, what would I say? Actually, the only thing that I can think of, and it is also in the realm of ideas, but maybe more of a story, and it's one of the narratives that I always sort of want to challenge is the coming out narrative, because I think that whenever you're talking, and I would do this if it were a personal oral history as much as I think it's important to do in a think piece, but this idea that, I think we have an idea that everybody comes out, that everybody starts out either not knowing what they are or thinking that there's something else, and then some pivotal thing happens in their world, and all of a sudden they realize they're queer. And from there, the story changes, and everything that they did before that maybe gets thought of differently, and everything they do after that gets framed in a certain way. And I think that, I don't think that that is nearly as common a story as we might like to think. I think we're taught to think of it that way, and I think it's really compelling because it gives us a connection point. Sort of like everybody who works at the company, well, we can all talk about the day we were hired, right? So it's one thing we've all got in common, right? So when you sort of end up in queer community spaces, we can all talk about how we showed up there in the first place. It's an easy sort of into connecting with people. But I know that for me, my experience was not about thinking I was one thing, moving through the world, having a watershed moment, and realizing I was something else, and then reinterpreting it all. For me, it was actually always about being me and having the desires I had and the perspectives I had. And as time went forward, noticing more and more that not everyone was like me, right? And I'm talking from childhood onward. It was more like so you mean everybody's not attracted to people of a range of genders? Okay, so which one is it okay for me to like? That one. Okay, well that's in the range, so I'll go with that for now. All right, but there must be something else out there, so I'm just gonna keep looking for it. And it took a while, and there they are. Okay, all right, well maybe I can, and so it was, same with SM, it was sort of like, well, of course power's sexy. Of course intense physical stimulation is sexy. Oh, do you mean not everyone likes that? Okay, well so far it hasn't been a problem in my relationships. Oh, do you mean there's a whole community of people who does that? Oh, look at that. And it was much more about that than about ever feeling like I was this thing and became something else. And I think that's really important because I don't think it does us any favors to rewrite the scripts of our lives so that they match up with a coming out narrative that connects us. I think that we can connect in broader ways than that if we can acknowledge that for some of us, who we are hasn't radically shifted. It's just found new places to go. Yeah. So.
Absolutely. That was my experience too.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good.
And I often get interested about, what silences us as we grow up. When you know in your heart of hearts and deeply in your core that this is who I am, and yet you're looking around and you're finding no one like you. That how isolating that is, how silencing it is. And also there's those psychological stages of how important it is to belong and to be accepted and be part of the in crowd.
Yes.
And then you kind of have to hide away the secret so that you can get through those years.
And that's about survival sometimes, and it's justifiable. But I think that what's that?
We're both from Hamilton.
Oh,
so,
God.
so she was just mentioning Hamilton. Yes, the pressure.
There you go.
You have to be a certain way. So.
Right. Yeah, and I grew up in Ottawa and in suburban Montreal, so yeah, also very, and talk about language and all kinds of things. But I think that, like for me, this sort of not quite coming out, but more like allowing oneself to emerge into what you already were, and part of that I think is also again to flip it around and go, okay, well, because if we have these coming out narratives, who are we excluding from our ways of thinking, our theories, our communities, who do also have those things in them and who've made different choices about how to deal with them, right? The only story available is not, he's actually gay, but he married that woman because he's repressed, right? That's not the only way you can, that's not the only picture, right? There may be lots of people who never find our communities, who never read our theories, who still have something in them that makes them different, sexually speaking, or in terms of their gender, than what they might appear to be, or what the world reads them as, or what they, and it doesn't, and not all of those people are going to have a watershed moment. And maybe they're perfectly comfortable with who they are, and they've chosen to live that existence out in a place that we would never meet them, right? But I think, again, it's that I don't want to universalize. I don't think everybody's queer. But I think that we need to have some better nuance in how we think about these things to make room for the fact that our struggles and the things that we're working for with queer liberation are not just about liberating the queers. They're about changing the world, right? And giving more room for all kinds of possibilities that we can't think of yet. We haven't met them yet. They're not here. We'll find out what it is we've made space for when we've made space for it, So, yeah, anyway.
Great. Thank you so much. That's great. I really appreciate that.
That was very good, incredible.
Yes.
Did you say incredible as in?
Incredible.
Oh, incredible.
The fact is that yes, queer liberation has to change the world. We don't want to change ourselves.
Yeah.
And we don't want to fit in. We want the world to see us how we are.
Yeah, open up.
So in order to do that, they've got to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that theme, I just love some of the links. We're kind of privileged in that way because we're doing all these interviews. And
Yeah,
so
you get to see them.
Someone last night made the same comment about one of the most important pieces of queer liberation is that it has something to teach the rest of society.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, elevating ourselves and getting ourselves to a place of a better life, which is important, he said, but at the same time, there's something to be learned from what we're doing by the rest of society as well. Like we're liberating our existences, and we'll be liberating theirs because they're quite constrained in mainstream society.
Yeah.
So it was just that link. You said it now, and I thought, great, this is good.
I will edit, so we pair that with this. Yeah. Nice.
So who's to say we're not the normal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then what would that do?
Right, exactly.
And what problems would that bring with it, Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
I'm really glad you asked.
And I'm glad I met you.
Yeah.
And the committee was right on.
Oh, good. Sweet. I'm so glad. I'm still, wow, now I really want to know who's on your I think the fun and frustrating thing about being a blogger is I have no idea who reads me.
Right.
Not a